You know, if you read the 13 letters of the Apostle Paul in the order they're actually printed in the Bible, you are completely missing the incredible, gritty story of his actual life. Why? Well, because they're organized by length, longest to shortest, from Romans all the way down to Philemon. So in this explainer, we're going to fix that. We're going to look at this correspondence the way it was truly meant to be experienced.
Think about it. We lose so much of the narrative with our standard order. Honestly, it'd be like trying to understand a friend's entire life by organizing their emails by word count instead of the date they actually sent them. But when we rearrange these 13 letters chronologically over a 15-year span, from roughly AD 49 to 67, a completely different picture emerges. We literally get to watch this dramatic character arc of a man dealing with very real daily human struggles, fighting tooth and nail for a brand new movement, and evolving as a leader.
Okay, let's dive into this. We can trace Paul's journey through 4 distinct phases of his evolving ministry and his evolving suffering. Phase 1, the street fighter. Phase 2, messy relationships. Phase 3, joy in chains. And finally, Phase 4, the final winter. Let's start the clock.
We enter Phase 1, this energetic street fighter phase, kicking off around AD 48 with his letter to the Galatians. Paul is furiously defending his message here. And to understand his anger, you really have to remember he had literally just survived a brutal mob stoning in a city called Lystra. They dragged him outside the gates and left him for dead. So he plants these new churches, heads home, and immediately hears that other teachers are sweeping in right behind him, telling these brand new Gentile believers that Paul's message just wasn't enough. They were being told they had to adopt strict Jewish customs and rules to truly be saved.
As you can imagine, Paul is absolutely livid. I mean, he completely skips the polite small talk in this letter and just goes right for the throat. His core argument? Grace is enough. No training wheels needed. He was furious that people were adding religious performance metrics to grace, arguing that those old ceremonial laws were just temporary tutors, kind of like training wheels on a bike, pointing to something much better. In Galatians, he writes that in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. He was effectively leveling the playing field for everyone, tearing down every single societal dividing wall.
So let's look at the next letter and see how this builds. Over in the city of Thessalonica, Paul runs into a totally different problem. Believers there were gripped by this intense theological fear. They were terrified that their loved ones who had recently died would miss the second coming of Jesus. And some were so panicked about the imminent end of the world that they literally just quit their jobs and sat around waiting. Paul steps right in and brilliantly connects deep theology with practical, everyday struggles. He reassures them about the afterlife, absolutely, but then he firmly tells them to keep working. Hoping in the future doesn't cancel out your daily responsibilities, right? Show up to work.
Now we push forward into Phase 2, spanning roughly AD 53 to 57. And man, this is a deeply painful period for Paul. It's heavily marked by messy relationships, intense betrayal, and basically putting out fires in the morally chaotic, wealthy port city of Corinth. If Galatia was the place where Paul fought for doctrine, Corinth was where he had to fight for basic human decency.
And this brilliantly illustrates how Paul functioned as a leader. He didn't just sit around writing abstract theology. He consistently anchored these high-level spiritual concepts directly into the daily, gritty struggles of those early churches. In Galatia, the struggle was adding religious rules, so his advice was grace alone. In Thessalonica, people were quitting their jobs in panic. His advice? Keep working. In Corinth, the daily struggle was fierce factions, lawsuits, and sheer arrogance. His answer for them? Love.
And that brings us to a crucial redefinition of a super famous text. I'm sure you've heard the love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, read at weddings. But in its original context, love was not meant to be sweet romantic poetry. It was a desperately needed solution for a church that was literally ripping itself apart with pride and division, where people were treating their spiritual gifts like trophies just to look down on everyone else. It was a battle cry for basic human decency in a completely fractured community. Paul's telling them, look, you can have faith that moves mountains, but without love, you're just a clanging cymbal. You're just noise.
Sadly, the relational mess in Corinth gets much worse by his second letter. False teachers who arrogantly called themselves super apostles showed up and publicly humiliated Paul. They questioned his credentials, they called him weak. So how does Paul respond to this kind of harsh betrayal? Well, he doesn't list his miracles, he doesn't read off his theological degrees. He visually overwhelms them with his sheer physical suffering. He lists his scars. Just look at this resume. 3 shipwrecks, multiple scourgings, beaten with rods, stoned, left in the freezing cold. He proved his genuine authority through his pain.
During this incredibly low period, Paul shares something deeply personal, a thorn in the flesh that tormented him every single day. He begged God 3 times to take it away, but God didn't give him the physical miracle he prayed for. Instead, he received a profound answer. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." Paul took his unanswered prayers for physical healing and reframed them into a masterclass on enduring pain. He learned that suffering isn't evidence of failure. Actually, it's where God's power is shown most clearly.
Which brings us to phase 3. After writing to the Romans to meticulously build his theological case, a battered Paul finally arrives in Rome around AD 60. But he arrives in chains. He's just survived another arrest and another devastating shipwreck. For 2 whole years, he sits in a rented room, constantly chained to a rotating guard of Roman soldiers. And yet, from this confined, restricted space, he writes 4 absolutely incredible letters: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon.
And knowing this gives us incredible real-world context to one of Paul's most famous metaphors. When he wrote about putting on the armor of God in Ephesians, the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith, he wasn't just dreaming up fun military imagery. This was a direct, daily observation. He was staring right at the fully armed Roman soldier who was physically chained to his wrist. He took the very symbol of his earthly captivity and turned it into a brilliant, lasting lesson on spiritual readiness.
From that exact same prison, he writes to the Philippians, just overflowing with joy. And this is where he writes that famously misunderstood verse, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Now, people often use this as a hype slogan for winning a football game or landing a job promotion, but true endurance, as Paul meant it, means having the strength to handle abundance without arrogance and crushing poverty without despair. He was talking about enduring any extreme circumstance, even starvation and potential execution, without ever losing his faith.
His 4th prison letter, Philemon, is where Paul's theology really hits the gritty reality of the ancient world. A runaway slave named Onesimus meets Paul in Rome and becomes a believer. Legally, at that time, a runaway slave could be brutally executed. But Paul sends Onesimus back to his Christian master, Philemon, with a completely radical request. He challenges Philemon to totally upend the cultural status quo. He tells him to welcome Onesimus back not as a piece of property, but with a new kingdom status, as an equal, beloved brother.
In that same short letter, Paul drops this astonishing line: "If he owes you anything, put that on my account." Just think about that. Paul is beautifully acting out the very gospel he preaches in a real, tense, financial and relational conflict. He steps right into the middle of the mess to absorb the cost himself, perfectly modeling what he believed Christ did for all of humanity. He's applying high theology to real money and real consequences. This brings us to phase 4, the final years. Paul gets released around AD 62 and spends time writing practical guidance to young pastors like Timothy and Titus, who are out there trying to lead these chaotic, disorganized churches. But the political climate darkens rapidly. By AD 67, Emperor Nero begins his terrifying persecution of Christians, blaming them for the burning of Rome. Paul is arrested once again, but this time, it's not a comfortable rented house. It's a dark, underground dungeon.
But before we enter that final cell, let's pause on a profound realization Paul shares in his first letter to Timothy. He writes, "Christ came to save sinners, of whom I am chief." Notice the present tense there, I am. Even after decades of planting churches across the known world, suffering for his faith, and writing masterful theology, the aging apostle still views himself right now as the primary recipient of grace. The longer he walked with Christ, the more he realized his own desperate need for him. That right there is profound spiritual maturity.
1. This stark number represents the agonizing solitude of Paul's final days in the dark, freezing Mamertine prison. His companions have either been sent away on missions, they've been arrested themselves, or they've simply abandoned him out of sheer fear of the Roman Empire. He writes in his final letter to Timothy that out of everyone he's known, only one person, Luke, is still standing by his side.
And from that freezing dungeon, he sends his very last personal request: bring the cloak and the books. It's just such a raw, intensely human moment. Here is an old man, fully aware that his life is pouring out and he is facing the executioner's sword. And he simply asks for a coat to survive the biting winter cold of the stone floor, and his books so he can keep learning, keep reading, and keep growing until the very last moment.
So, the crucial point is how he summarizes his life's work at the very end. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. He doesn't end on a stage with a stadium full of people cheering his name. He doesn't claim to have run a perfect race or to have won every single battle. He just says he finished it. He remained fiercely loyal to the message of grace he started with, actively choosing faithfulness over earthly perfection.
We've traced the incredible chronological arc of Paul's life in this explainer today, from a furious street fighter defending grace to a battered prisoner modeling joy and endurance. Which leads us to a final question. How will you choose to view your own unfinished race and your own seasons of suffering? Paul's gritty resilience teaches us that the gospel meets you exactly where you are, right in the middle of your mess. And it teaches us that your suffering might not be a failure, but the very place where true strength is forged. Take that endurance into your own daily struggles. Thanks for hanging out with me, and keep learning.